You are on mute, Boriche.
Sorry. Hello, and welcome everyone to today's panel on transnational liberatory feminist praxis. We're joined by three scholars and researchers, Dr. Portia Malaji, Dr. Chandra Frank, and Dr. Akanksha Mehta. So I think Dr. Mehta is going first. Each panelist will have 15 minutes to go through their paper with us, and afterwards we'll have our Q&A session. So, and Dr. Mehta, if you're ready, you can go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. On behalf of the three of us, I just want to thank everybody for being here and also for the chairs and everyone who's been organizing this conference. Really, thank you. We just wanted to begin by saying that we've sort of had a chat between the three of us, and we've decided to change the format a little bit. Mainly because I know that everybody in this room and us has been really fatigued in the last couple of years with the pandemic and with the ways in which we've all come to these online Zoom spaces, been teaching online. And we feel that instead of us going one after the other, telling you about our work, how about if we have a conversation between the three of us based on the themes that are still part of our papers, based on the themes of the panel, based on the themes of the conference, and bring out our research, our teaching, and our conversation through this dialogue between all of us. So we really hope that's okay, and also sort of shakes things up for all of us here in the evening. This is also the last panel for the day. So just in the hope that we can make it more energetic than us speaking one after the other.
I think that's fine. Thank you. So I don't know if you guys have any conversation points that you want to start with, or if you want me to lead with any questions to start a conversation.
So we've come up with a few questions and themes that we can put forth and basically use the time that we would have had 15 minutes each instead of that to have a conversation. And then after that, we leave it to you as the chair to ask us anything or bring in more questions. We don't want to increase your workload by our change in format in any way. So we can hopefully just have a flowing conversation, if that's fine.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you.
So I'm going to start off with a question that the three of us on this panel, myself, Akanksha, and my colleagues and friends, Chandra and Portia, can address. And the first question that I would like to throw to all of us, to including myself, would be around thinking about the very theme of this conference, which is rooted in the politics of healing, care, and love, and the very theme of our panel, which is rooted in thinking about transnational feminism. So I ask myself, and I sort of like ask my colleagues, friends, Chandra and Portia, how does our work, how does your work and your praxis relate to transnational feminism, care, and healing? And maybe we can have a conversation on that. And then I'll hand over to one of my panelists to take on the second question or the second theme. So would either of you like to start with that? And then I'll come into.
Thank you so much for getting us started. I really appreciate it. And to everybody here, as I'm thinking about care, the three of us, it's also been something that has sustained us as researchers, as scholars, as curators. And so that definitely feels like a point of departure in terms of thinking, how do we do transnational feminist work? So I'll just briefly say that in terms of my own practice, I've been really interested in thinking about specifically queer and feminist histories of color in the Netherlands in the 1980s, and kind of been thinking about how to frame those histories within a colonial context, as well as kind of acknowledging the exchange that happened within that history, and really thinking about what are different ways and what are different forms to tell stories about transnational feminist histories. How do we use archival materials? How do we kind of create a synergy between transnational histories, archival materials, and what are like different entry points of telling everyday stories of care and healing, And so I think for me, it's been really inspiring to be in conversation with both Portia and Concha over the years, to really kind of think about what does our transnational practice, how does that come into the work? How does that come into like methodology? Does that come into research? And one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time with is thinking about the politics of archives. So I have done research in predominantly white, feminist, and queer archives. And so I really needed to think about what are the politics of white feminist archives. What does it mean to kind of deal with the erasure and silence within those archives? And then how do we kind of bring those materials into the work? And I'm happy to further expand on that as the conversation goes on. But I think in terms of thinking about healing and care, there was like an understanding that working with those stories wasn't just about presenting that in the written format, but really thinking about what happens with how we relate to archival materials. Like, how do these materials orientate us as much as we orientate towards these materials? What does it mean to read about experiences, not just about racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia? What does it actually mean to allow those stories to do something with us? And how does that care then kind of come onto the page? So I think I've been really thinking about care in relationship to archives and storytelling and healing, and asking questions about what care looks like, what kind of maintenance it requires, what kind of like affect it produces, and how we bring that into the work. So I'll just like leave it at that, but I just wanted to start off with bringing archives into the conversation and relating that a little bit to care and healing.
Thanks, Chandra. I'll go next and maybe bring it back a little bit to the title of our panel, which we were joking at each other a little bit earlier on about how we wrote this and proposed this, pre-pandemic, and had all these ideas about how we want to construct and structure this. And obviously the pandemic has changed quite a lot of things. But even though some things have changed, some things have stayed the same. And I just wanted to draw attention to this idea of healing waters. And I know that, Chandra, you do a lot of work around water and waterways and their colonial history. But my particular interest is a visual culturist who's interested in artistic practice, and always sort of orientate my thinking around what artists are doing and how they're conceiving of the world and representing particular ideas, is to think about this idea of spirituality. There seems to be this spiritual turn in artistic practice on the continent, particularly in South Africa. A lot of young artists such as Buhlebezo Siwane, Sethembile Msezane, Skhumbuzo Makandula are doing such incredible work around ideas of African spiritualities. And one of the things that is often tapped into is the healing capacity of water. And water is that which is sort of used in a lot of sort of rituals in again, African spiritual practices. But even though we may orientate healing practices around and spiritual practices around water, we need to also consider the complexities and the nuances and maybe even the contradictions of water as not only always being a healing potential and healing capacity. For instance, if we're thinking about sort of transnational friendship and collegiality, one might think and orientate it around water, but the way in which we think about that is ideas around diaspora and how the diaspora is essentially potentiated or enabled by this incredibly violent encounter that takes as at its premise an encounter with water. So I'm just very interested in this idea of like what healing is, and the other side of healing, if one doesn't do what one ought to do in order to achieve the healing, how there might actually be consequences and repercussions for such actions. And I'm talking here again, rooting it in ideas of spirituality, which we can expand on a little bit later on. but yeah, I just wanted to sort of think about this idea of spirituality as it relates to our conversations, as it relates to healing, as it relates to contemporary South African, specifically artistic practice, but also how it is not only this majestic thing, or it is always majestic, but there's potential for trauma essentially associated with water.
So to just come in from that, thank you, Chanda and Posha. And also just to say that like exactly how Chanda and Posha have mentioned, like this panel space itself came out of a collaboration that is transnational, that is rooted in feminist care and healing and friendship. And a lot has changed in the pandemic, but one of the things that I'm grateful for that has not changed is exactly this transnational feminist friendship between the three people here, as well as between so many of us who work together and have found ways to keep doing that healing work across, across locations. So my research is quite different in some ways, in the sense that like a large part of my research in the last few years and as continuing is actually to look at the transnational connections between violence. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about and also doing ethnographic research with women who are active in far right movements in the global south in particular, but also in other locations as well, and thinking about the ways in which this violence has transnational connections that we need to pay attention to. A lot of my work has focused on the participation of women in a right-wing movement in India called the Hindu right wing, which is also in parliamentary power at the moment for the last many years, since 2014, and has a really big influence in the region and globally. And to think about the ways in which women are involved in the violence of this movement, and they carry out the everyday acts of violence of this movement, including everyday acts of care that are very much entangled with violence. So this is where the question of care for me becomes really complicated, because I've been thinking through and writing about and researching the ways in which the politics of care gets very entangled with the politics of nationalism and the politics of settler colonialism. The other half of my work, which is not based in India, is based in Palestine, where it looks at women's involvement in the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine, and again looks at these questions of how women's everyday politics, which are very much rooted in violence, in settler colonialism, in dispossession, are also entangled in regimes of care. And here care becomes a way for women to surveil each other, to control each other in these movements, as well as to like continue to dispossess Palestinians and to cause violence against Muslims and oppressed caste communities in India. So this is one half of like how my research kind of relates to very similar questions, but from a very disturbing and kind of horrible perspective in a way, where like all the connections that I've been looking at, connections through water, connections through materiality, connections through symbols, connections in the ways in which women's politics, women's so-called right-wing feminism, as they would call it, comes together, is again looking at the themes of healing, of care, of transnational connection, but very deeply entangled with the project of the state and project of settler colonialism and nationalism. And the reason that this research has taken up so many years of my life and has been something that I've been like thinking deeply about is because precisely by understanding these networks are we able to then intervene and stop these projects that are, growing in many ways, that are connecting very deeply across global landscapes, that are connecting, in places where you might even think that there are no connections, but these kinds of connections have become very prominent and are really honestly displacing the ways we think about healing and feminist care in the world. So this is half of the work. But as I've been doing this work in the last few years, I've gotten very interested in also doing a lot of research and writing about care in spaces of organizing and activism, particularly in the university, but also outside of the university. And how might we think about feminist care and feminist accountability and feminist justice in the context of coming together in student movements on campuses, coming together in other movements related to community organizing, abolition, and community education. So these sort of two facets of my research both connect to the questions that we are raising here and both relate to transnational feminism, care, healing, and all of these themes, but in completely different ways. And in some ways, the latter gives me hope and comfort in order to be able to understand the former and think about how we might intervene in the former and intervene in these cycles of violence. So I'll stop with that. And should I pass on to Chandra for the second question, or Posha for the second question?
Well, no, not to jump onto the second question. I just thought maybe we could hop on a little bit and just stay with this idea of transnational feminisms and maybe complicate it a little bit. I mean, I think Akanksha, you've alluded to it a bit. And I think that three of us may have been a bit lucky in sustaining the transnational friendship that's a feminist friendship that's been happening for the past couple of years. But we know that that hasn't always been the case. Whether with each other as in extensions of each other or with other sort of transnational feminist groups that we might be a part of. And I just, wanted to us to maybe, I know, discuss this idea of, I met you guys when I was in London at Goldsmiths doing my PhD, came back here. But in my encounter there, there were obviously a lot of groups that were formed around this notion of feminism, but we know that not all of them were sustained for a number of reasons, one of them being, and this is like a woman of color collective, right? One of them being not acknowledging being a woman of color from the diaspora or living in the diaspora versus what it means to actually be a woman of color, a Black woman even, living in say in Africa or in South America or in Southeast Asia. And the point of contention that Akanksha and I always sort of speak quite a lot about is the question of fedphobia as well, that sometimes circles these transnational feminist networks. So in as much as there's occasion to glorify and to celebrate them, there is a lot obviously that constantly needs to be negotiated and worked through. And I was thought to think maybe we ought to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Chandra, just come in at any point. I think we can just have a free-flowing conversation. I agree, because it's also like it's easy for us to sit here today and say that like we've sustained these transnational feminist friendships, healing love in some kind of easy way, whereas we know that, as Portia has reminded us, that doing the work of transnational feminist friendships, care and healing requires enormous intentional effort, requires enormous accountability, requires enormous ways of communicating with feminist care as well. And I think Portia's reminder that like often in these spaces that we inhabit in academia, beyond academia, where we're doing this kind of research, teaching, friendship work, really, we also then don't hold ourselves accountable to a lot of violence and harm that we keep enacting. And we've all three of us on this panel have been in those situations, sometimes in situations related to fat phobia, sometimes in situations related to people not acknowledging their locations, whether it's race, class, gender, sexual, disability locations, sometimes in situations where people are using their locations to justify harm, that like I am not like this, but I'm only doing this because I have a disability of some kind, or like something like that. And so I think like that is also really useful as we sit together in this panel and flip the panel on its head to also discuss that like the politics of care, healing, transnational love that the conference wants to address and wants us to address are really complicated, can be really suffocating in their own ways, and can be a really like a very difficult field to navigate, given we are all also structurally facing so much violence in academia, outside of academia. So I'm glad that Portia, you've brought that up, because it helps us like de-rosify the kind of picture and also de-rosify our own relationship in this panel and to academia.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm glad you brought this up. I think if there's one thing that I've learned from my own friendships as well as my research, is that transnational feminisms and care and practices are often romanticized, especially when we historicize them, right? But when I was kind of doing this research into the Dutch context, I was looking at women coming together from former Dutch colonies. So talking about Suriname, the Dutch Caribbean, Indonesia, as well as labor migrants coming from Turkey, Morocco, countries surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. And then there was also an influx of undocumented women coming from a different range of countries, Latin America, countries in Latin America, as well as Afghanistan, Iran. So just kind of thinking about that unique constellation of diaspora, and then being kind of faced with, the anti-Black and anti-migrant rhetoric of the Dutch state, which obviously also has a deep history within the South African context. And so what I've kind of learned from looking at, let's say, newsletters, kind of interviews, doing archival research, is that it took a lot of work for these women to come together to really kind of critically talk about difference, to really critically think about what it means to be in solidarity with each other, right? And how diasporic connection depends on, who is willing to do the uncomfortable work to stand in solidarity with each other. And that work definitely, that was started in the 1980s, but it was definitely also unfinished, right? I think that's also the point of having some of these conversations, that we need to address, like, power, we need to address hierarchy, we need to address anti-Blackness, fat phobia, like how all these different things intersect with each other. And I think what is especially important in kind of thinking about what transnational feminism does and how it's theorized is also acknowledging that, usually within the field, within the discipline, but I think that also trickles down to conferences and conversations and publications. There's such a hierarchy of US transnational like feminisms and that kind of like framework. And as people who are located differently, although I'm currently in the US, I think it's also kind of really important to bring in these other models of thinking through diaspora and diasporic solidarity and the care, and again, the kind of like really honest, uncomfortable conversations that necessitates. And I think that's a very big part of transnational feminist collaboration, and is definitely not a given. And I think it's an important conversation. And I think it probably also, really allows us to again, when we're talking about transnational feminism and the project of transnational feminism, again, on the individual level and like within like the constellation of feminist academic collaboration, is also talking about access and resources and, how are we able to do this work? And, we've often been in situations where we couldn't all go to a conference together because I, for instance, have the privilege of having a Dutch passport. And, so it's easier for me to travel, and having those honest conversations and thinking about where we're located, how much funding we're getting, the differences in how our academic institutions are treating us. I mean, if we're not having these conversations in our, at the moment, we are in a WhatsApp, very active WhatsApp group. If we're not having those conversations in our WhatsApp group, then really what does it mean for us to, show up in the classroom and teach about transnational feminism, or, come to conferences or do that work? Like it's definitely really necessary to not just kind of come to panels and say like, oh, we're doing transnational feminist work, or this is what we're interested in, but like unpacking the layers and saying like, this is what it takes to come somewhere, or this is what it takes to not be somewhere, or this is how transnational feminism is informed by different ideas and experiences around spirituality or around water, which I have a response to you about, Portia, as well, but I'll leave it there for now.
There's a delicious comment in the chat, but I think maybe the chair will pick up on that later on, around feminist anger, which I'm enjoying quite a lot. But we can maybe hop on to the next question around our teaching, and the prompt, as it were, is to expand on methodologies, pedagogy that include healing, teaching, care, and to maybe offer some examples of that. Akanksha, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Portia, and thank you, Chandra, for that last intervention as well, because it also leads into the second prompt or second question to explore. as Chandra said, right, if we are not having these conversations and if you're not thinking about the way material power works in all of our lives and in our feminisms and our care and friendships, then what is the point of going to the classroom and talking about all of these things, or going to an academic conference and talking about all of these things? And I think I find that really useful to understand, because my pedagogical methods, methodologies, ethics are all related to paying a lot of attention to not just what is in the content, but actually the content to be structured by all of these very real questions. So I can't seem to separate the text from all of these larger questions of how our lives are organized, how we, hold ourselves accountable to seek justice, how we think about liberation, how we think about the actual realities of academia. And on a very sort of practical method, like some of the things that I make sure that are very much part of my pedagogy is that everything that I teach in the classroom is connected deeply to the campus and to everything happening around us. So for example, I teach a module this semester. It's called Race, Empire, Nation. It's about race, colonialism, slavery, and nationalism, and how all of these things connect, and how the afterlives of colonialism and slavery continue to exist in contemporary politics. And throughout that module, we keep connecting every single conversation to the realities of life on campus as well. So why is it that security guards and cleaners on our campuses are outsourced and are on horrible contracts and are not included in, given the kind of rights that other staff are given? I'm talking in the context of like UK universities now, where this is something quite common. Or thinking about the experiences of Black and brown students on campus who might have led, protests and movements to change the conditions of the university, or thinking about the university itself and how exploitative it is in terms of how 60-70% of staff in UK universities are on precarious casualized contracts and are paid hourly. So how can we separate all of these questions from questions of race, of gender, of sexuality? And that's one of the ways in which I think of pedagogy as healing and as caring, precisely by making students open up to these realities of the conditions in which the knowledge that they are learning from, or learning with, or learning through, or contributing through, are being created, and the very conditions in which the teachers are teaching them, and the very locations of that university. And simple things like we've gone back to in-person seminars and in-person classes in the UK. And just the idea that like the institution is continuously saying that we're making this as safe as possible for you, but who's doing the actual work of making that classroom safe, the actual work of coming in and making sure that the classroom is sanitized, and sort of making sure the students understand that what we are studying in these texts and theories should not ever be divorced from what is going on around us, and how we're all implicated in that, and how for decades academic knowledge production has somehow separated these two, including feminist academic knowledge production, which has become really divorced from the realities of struggles for gender justice on the ground. So that's sort of the first way in which healing and care come in to my teaching. Another couple of things that I just want to say, and then I'll pass on, is to also then think of teaching as organizing. And so teaching as a way of political organizing, of bringing sort of radical ideas into the classroom, beyond just radical ideas that are deeply theoretical, but also radical ideas in terms of how to do community work and organizing. So if we are going to talk about race, empire, nation, we can talk about that from an abolitionist perspective right from the beginning. So structuring the teaching in ways in which not only are we critiquing and this is what's wrong with the world and this is what happened and this is how messed up it is, but actually opening up worlds to like futures that we have not even imagined, futures of abolition, futures of, different sorts of healing and love, radical kinship, radical love. So that's the other thing which I feel like gives my pedagogy a sort of sense of like that I'm not walking into that room to just present this picture that also many students already know is quite gloomy and quite violent about the world. They have already experienced the structural violence of the world in different ways, but instead to then structure that entire pedagogical practice into one that is about abolition, that is about futures, that is about imagination, that is about radical hope, radical love, and radical kinship. And to that, then that connects to my final point in terms of this, then the practice of teaching and the practice of pedagogy also then cannot be divorced from thinking about care very actively. So different forms of enacting that care in how you relate to the students and how you build that community in the classroom, creating access, intimacy in that classroom, the term that I borrow from from Mia Mingus, where we are able to understand each other's access needs without even having to really articulate them over and over again, where we are able to come together as a community of students. And of course, this has its faults. And also I'm quite privileged. I have a permanent position in a UK university where I'm given some autonomy to be able to do some of these things in the classroom without much backlash or without any backlash in many cases. So I'm also speaking from that position, and I'm quite mindful that this is not possible for everybody in all situations, but to really change the tone of the classroom from one which is hierarchical and the teacher is supposed to be giving things to the students and the students are supposed to be sitting there and absorbing all of this, but instead to think about the kind of work that Bell Hooks has done and the kind of work that other scholars who have written about pedagogy have done, and to create a community that is focused on organizing, on care, on futures, on abolition, on creating forms of love and access, while also then reading really difficult, complicated texts and theories and generating really difficult, complicated texts and theories by ourselves. So I'll stop there. Sorry if I can go on about this for a long time, so sorry if I spoke too much, but just to pass on to Chandra Posha.
You go, Portia.
Yeah, I just think that my particular approach to trying to implement some kind of pedagogy of care, especially for students of color, stems to a particular degree from my own experience being in both South African universities and then a UK university. So there's like an constant autobiographical reflection when in the classroom and needing to essentially, I don't know, perhaps overperform care in order to not perpetuate the experiences that I and many of us have experienced. And yeah, I think the trauma of being at the fine art department at Wits University was something else. And then both of you will obviously know about the experience of my Viva at Goldsmiths, and how that wasn't actually an isolated incident, how a lot of, especially women of color in UK universities, always experience these incredibly violent Vivas. And how that can be detrimental to your experience of academia, to the experience of your research afterwards. But I've recently been doing a lot of external examining of master's and PhD theses, and I take extra care to be extra, to give extra care. Especially when it is a person of color, to sort of indicate that the university, as violent as it is, there are moments of refuge that one can receive. But you were speaking a little bit earlier on, Akanksha, about your ability of being free in the classroom to teach the kind of content that you teach, and how there isn't necessarily backlash from the university. And my experience has been that there's backlash from the students when you want to teach this kind of material. There's constant pushback, there's constant pushing against what is this care that you're talking about? What is this healing that you're talking about? Why are you centering colonialism and all these things as that which needs to be healed against? So it's been, I think initially it took me by surprise to actually be in that particular context, and to try and to immediately try to defend the position and the positionality, but rather to sort of take a step back and try to have a conversation with the students. But what has been quite enlightening for me, and was quite enjoyable, this is particularly last year when I first joined UCT, was how the very, very few students of color in the classroom are very instrumental in actually putting these ideas forward and making sure that their voices are heard. And I certainly did not have the privilege of being able to do that when I was studying. So I do think that some things are changing, while some things are definitely, still staying the same. Yeah, but I think what has become very important to me is to ensure that not to ensure, because that's also quite a like a lot to take on, but to try as much as possible that students of color don't experience the same kind of violences that some of us experienced. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is such such a important, difficult, broad topic, right? And I think, we could easily go on about this, I'm sure, but I think, like I've always been like precarious faculty, currently like on a 2-year postdoc, which I think is the most stability that I've had in a very long time. And it always strikes me that as adjuncts, as people who are kind of like contingent to the academy, especially in the UK, in the Netherlands, like as well, and sometimes also in the US, like it's very like these are very white institutions that have like, inherently anti-Black hiring practices as it is, which, I think also an extension of this conversation for myself is thinking about what does it mean to be like a brown woman, in these departments. And of course, like if we're having conversations about that, that sometimes means that the way that Black and brown women academics and non-binary academics are kind of pigeonholed or racialized and stereotyped, is that there is also like, a larger conversations to be held there. And I think for anybody who has sat through The Chair, the Netflix series, there is like, there is some kind of resemblance of some of those conversations happening. I'm not trying to start up a conversation between us about The Chair, but I'm using this example just to kind of think about what it means to even enter the academy, right? So I'm thinking about myself, like coming into the academy as a brown woman, like on the one hand, like, I want to acknowledge as precarious faculty that I'm doing often so much more labor and care practices. And I know you like both have also experiences with this of like students will like email you, they will come to your office hours, they will ask you for help, they will kind of like flock towards you. And meanwhile, the institution has you on the most precarious contract, like paying you like very little, right? And you still, like you both said, also want to kind of have integrity in how you teach and what you bring into the classroom, which also often means that you're doing more work than like, your average white faculty member, who's on a permanent contract. And so that kind of, especially for those of us teaching on race, on like histories of colonialism, I've had classrooms where I've had to have really, intervening conversations and, really have to kind of make sure that students, especially like when in teaching in classroom settings where often there's like a smaller group of Black and brown students, it's like, how do you also make sure that, when a white student says something like racist, for instance, how do you like intervene in that moment? But also, how do we have the larger conversation about, what it means to do that care work within the institution, within the classroom? So, I think it's a very active conversation. I think there are so many intricacies around teaching, around care, around healing. And I just know that institutions right now, and I think, especially in the US context, but I'm sure other contexts are really kind of, trying to push for hires that center quote unquote like care or healing or social justice, right? And like very specifically like kind of targeting like diversity. And I'm just thinking about how it's created this like schism where we are like in need of permanent jobs, hired for these, into these white universities for specific kind of like, diversity purposes, and how you just end up doing all this additional labor, which you just don't get back from the institution. And I think, yeah, amongst ourselves is definitely also a conversation about how much are you able to give, how much are you also like, how much care are you receiving, and from where is this care coming from? But yeah, definitely also thinking about the institutional politics, right? And how we're read. And like I said, like I'm thinking about that conversation, like from, like you said, Portia, like even like defending your PhD was like a violent experience because of the examiners you had. But, that kind of having to kind of have critical conversations about, you know, what that means basically for us to come out of like PhD programs and like then come into the university space, and being really honest again about how we're racialized differently, how anti-Blackness like operates, how we know like brown women who've had different experiences, you know. So I think there's something important there in this whole trajectory and how we come into the classroom.
Yeah, and just to, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt the flow. I just wanted to know, we have just about 20 minutes. I wanted to know if you guys want me to catch you off at a certain point so we can engage with the audience questions, or you just want to flow to the end, because I don't want to cut off the flow. Yeah.
I think audience participation is important. If there are questions, I mean, there are a lot of comments that are happening, but I do think that maybe 5 more minutes and then open it up.
Agree.
Sorry, just to say that, you know, Khorata has, I hope it is Khorata, mentioned something about, you know, we need a round table, more like a 10-day conference around, you know, women of color and the additional sort of care and labor that they perform in academic institutions. Concurred. I think every one of us will have, you know, hours and hours and hours of content to speak about. But should we maybe conflate the last two questions and be brief about our responses? Chandra?
Yes. So for the last two questions, we're going to bring together the role of collaboration and healing and care. So what are different conversations about art and activism that we're having, and what is the role of our friendship in that?
I can go first. I'm currently working on an exhibition that's going to open on the 9th or 10th of February at Norval Foundation in Cape Town. And it's an exhibition of Black women artists. And we're looking at the period between 1940 and the year 2000. And the idea around this exhibition, which I'm doing collaboratively with a colleague from WITS, Notobeka Ntombela, is essentially trying, again, you know, this idea of trying to fill the gap in the way in which Black women artists have actually been inserted or excluded out of art history, out of South African art history. And the premise is essentially that there are about 5 artists that are well known. You know, you have your Gladys Nkudlandlu, Helen Sibidi, Noria Mabasa, Esther Mahlangu, and I'm probably forgetting a few others. But there are about 100 other artists who are unknown. And I use the word unknown with caution because, you know, people may ask, when you say unknown, what do you mean? Unknown by whom? So there's quite a bit of a contention around using the word of unknown and unestablished or unacknowledged. But I'm sort of bringing this up to signal to the fact that, you know, our practices, Black women curators, especially in the country, our practices are sort of rooted in essentially trying to undo and to heal, you know, sort of the violence of the past. And, you know, there's a lot of emotion and a lot of work and a lot of labor that goes into putting an exhibition such as this together. And the reason is because of the way in which these women have been omitted from art history, is because of the way in which, you know, the South African art scene operates. So it feels as though, you know, Black women curators and artists might also argue the same, are constantly engaged in some kind of activist work, primarily because all or most of the exhibitions that we try to do are constantly either trying to undo something or to heal something that has been wounded. I'm cognizant of the time, so I think maybe I'll just leave it there it's just sort of a signpost about the ways in which we need to operate. And I say we need to operate, not because everybody ought to be doing this, because some people just opt out of engaging with this kind of restorative work, which obviously is their right. It's their right to make that kind of decision, because it can be quite burdensome, I think, to be engaged in this kind of work out of duty. But for some of us, there's a sense that, this is a work that needs to be done. We can't essentially look towards futurity if the past is riddled with mistakes and with injustices. Yeah, I'll end there.
So to carry on from that, I was just also reflecting on some of the comments that we were having just earlier about just how institutions behave and what they do to all of us and what they do to students as well. One of the things that I've been working on recently is collectively, I do a lot of work collectively with students together. So also to think about how that care in the classroom and creating that community in the classroom goes beyond the end of that module or end of that academic year. And we continue to be in community, doing things together, creating spaces that we wish the university created for us, but it doesn't. So we will create them ourselves outside of the university, in the university, wherever we can. And so one of the things that we are now trying to do is to have a program of political education based in the university, but also in the local neighborhood. And so that's been the sort of most recent collaborative work that I've been doing. And we call it political education. What it really is community focused, collective forms of like knowledge production and knowing together and feeling together. And the first session that we had was in the beginning of October, where we brought together many, many, many different people on campus who are engaged in various kinds of struggles, from, fighting against redundancies to fighting for their rights as security guards and cleaners, to fighting against institutional racism, to fighting gentrification that the university is causing, and to really think about a critical history of the university. It was aimed at getting students who have just entered university to start engaging with the very clear critiques of the university and to imagine education beyond the university. So for me, that kind of collaborative work always becomes a sort of project of critiquing, but also then of building something new. And when we were trying to think of a name for the series, we went through many names, including fuck the university, destroy the university, all of that. And then we thought, like, why even have the word university in it? So we decided to call it Reimagining Education, because the whole point was that, like, okay, so we're going to do this collaborative work of like figuring out what is wrong with this place and what is wrong with these institutions, but also then do the more important restorative work of like healing and caring and coming up with different ways in which we can learn together and be together. And I think this is where I was just thinking of what Portia said, right? Like, in order to build those futurities, we need to understand what the past has done and what the way in which the past is riddled with mistakes and injustice. And so in some ways, like the community education work that I do, or that I do with a lot of other people in my community, needs to really hold that into account as well. So that's been, and what does it mean to foster friendships? I'm still figuring this out because it's such a complicated question. On one hand, friendships are everything in these spaces. You cannot survive these spaces without friendships. On the other hand, the structures of these spaces are so violent that they actually get into your friendships sometimes. These structures make us compete with one another. These structures make us feel terrible about each other. These structures sometimes wash over our differences in power, as Chandra pointed out, how brown women are located differently from Black women, how brown women themselves are structured through caste and class. All of these differences kind of go away sometimes because of these structures, and sometimes they get really magnified because of these structures, and all of that creates problems. So I'm really hoping that like we can do this work of figuring out these friendships and how to keep them into healing, nurturing, loving spaces, because a lot of my friendships have emerged from these spaces. And I really hope that, they all don't collapse because of these spaces. I hope we are able to escape the ways in which these spaces break us, is how my friend had recently put it. My friend Chloe Turner had said, I wish we would find ways in which we wouldn't allow these spaces to keep breaking us. So yeah, so that's the question of the friendship. Chandra?
Yeah, I'm conscious of time, so I'll keep it brief. But I think I wanted to circle back to the idea of water, and I think so. Part of what I'm writing and thinking about right now is how water structures so much. And I'm talking about not just like the context of the Netherlands, but like a more kind of diasporic idea around how water kind of structures some of our kind of filling, our presence, like the exchange in physical ways, but also in more kind of like immaterial ways, and kind of like the traveling of that. And so I'm trying not to just, for instance, like focus on the colonial implications of like Dutch water management, which have been devastating and violent for multiple contexts, for South Africa, Indonesia, the like Dutch Caribbean, but really kind of thinking about how can I create different synergies and collaboration, for instance, with artistic practice. And this comes back to something you said earlier, Portia, about how water is used as a form of healing within different South African artistic practice. And so I'm trying to kind of create that synergy, also very specifically through collaboration. And I think this is something that I wanted to kind of highlight, is that for me, kind of doing any kind of academic research project is usually coupled with trying to kind of find collaboration, whether it's like through arts or through different kind of forms of doing like conferences or symposiums or conversations. But also amongst ourselves, we are actually, I think between the three of us, we're currently working on like 4 different like projects. Like you two are doing a book, Portia and I are doing an exhibition, Akansha and I are writing a book. Like, so this is, I think, also the work of trying to figuring it out, kind of staying with the messiness of everything, but trying to kind of like figuring out what it means to us. So that's maybe also where some of those like kind of water care, healing elements come into, especially now that we haven't been able to travel and see each other, but still kind of keeping some of that alive through doing the work, which definitely isn't easy. So I'll leave it there so we can engage with questions.
Thank you guys so much for this talk. So there's still a question in the chat around feminist anger, which I think Dr. Malachi referenced. And there have been engagements on that. And there's a couple of questions I want to ask as well, selfishly. So you guys are free to engage those in any thread that you want. So I'm thinking with Dr. Mete's paper on feminist pedagogy. I'm thinking with Dr. Frank's paper on Sister Outsider and Audre Lorde. And I'm thinking with Dr. Malachi's paper on the Is I Am Sky installation. And as I'm formulating these questions, so I'm thinking about Dr. Joy James' concept of the captive maternal and the ways in which oftentimes the care work that we do, even though it is to sustain the people that we love, the people that we care for, our communities, often ends up inevitably sustaining these violent institutions that are trying to eradicate, right? So like the care work that feminist professors like you will do for your students allows the university to continue to exist as like a site of exploitation, even though that isn't the purpose of your work, right? And so I'm thinking, you guys can take that in any direction at all. And I'm also thinking about again, the university as this site of exploitation, but also the university as oftentimes the site where we curate these archives that serve to like inform these synergies in our transnational feminisms, right? And like the contradictions that exist there, right? How does that impact what the archive looks like? How does that impact what the relations look like when the university is the one that holds these knowledges that inform our feminism? So any of those, any of you are free to take that. Sorry.
I don't know if I have a response necessarily, but rather to say that I hear you on how, women of color's care work sustains the university and sustains the, its exploitative capacity. And to hear that hurts, to be honest. But it's very true. It is so true. And what hurts even more is how this care work actually does sustain the university, but the university, it's incredibly invisibilized labor, right? This is a conversation that we'll all be very familiar with. I had an incident where I essentially refused to be exploited within the department and was then accused of not being generous and not working with the spirit of generosity that all staff members essentially like extend to each other. I had to come back with like, you cannot even begin to say that to me. Like the amount of labor that I do, this invisible care and labor that I do outside of your periphery and in your blind spot is incredible. And yeah, so it's the addition of exploiting the care and labor of women and women of color while also refusing to acknowledge it that I think hurts even more.
Yeah, just to kind of continue from there, it's so true. And I think this is where we have to be really careful, because the university will give us a seat on the table every now and then, in order to take the work that we are doing, in order to like take the work and whitewash it and change its form, shape, and meaning completely. And I've seen this happen to colleagues of color, women of color, that they become part of the university in that sense. And also, so then to like really think about how the work that we do is not appropriated. And of course it will be appropriated on some level in different ways, but to like, for example, not become part of management or not join certain things, or to sort of continue to signal to the university that, you know, you will not stand for them to take over this work. I learn a lot from the Antiracist Occupation at my university, Goldsmiths, where also Chandra and Portia have done their PhD. So we're all connected to this institution where I teach. And the Antiracist Occupation of the university, led by students of color, lasted 137 days in 2019. And over the years since then, the university has tried a lot to take this work, credit for this occupation in different ways. For example, you know, the work that they did during occupation to be like, oh, look, we've done this. And they've always like very, very vehemently stood against the university, fought, even when the university has offered money, and they've offered lots of money for something or the other. The occupation students have been like, no, we won't let this work be whitewashed in this way. So I think that is also then our responsibility to make sure that we draw that line in which we don't let the university co-opt what we are doing, and to always maintain a sort of anti-establishment, anti-university vibe in the kind of like work we do, especially when the university is going to be built on the kind of wealth it is built on, is going to be institutionally racist, is going to be white in every way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the comments in the chat about feminist anger and feminist apology are really provocative in terms of thinking further and collectively, and thinking where that may kind of like, you know, take us. And I think this idea of like feminist anger, and as well as, you know, what accountability looks like, it really kind of forces us to think beyond the institution, right? Because there's no easy way in or out. Like those of us who are doing additional care, you know, especially Black and brown women, often end up, you know, overworked, burned out, like, and, you know, to be honest, like dying earlier, you know, sooner. And so I think there's a larger implication there to also have conversations with people who have thought of other structures, you know, of not doing that or doing it differently. Or I'm just looking at the chat, or using the paycheck to be on the run, you know. I mean, I think the only way to figure out how we do this is to be in collaborative, uncomfortable, necessary conversation, because this is also the care work that we do is also not like the pathway to like liberation as it currently is, right? I mean, I think as it stands, we're all doing like really important work, but we also use this WhatsApp group chat to like offload in every way like the implications of this care work, you know. And I think that's important to consider. What are the other models? What are the other forms of being in and out of the institution? I'm aware of time, so I'm going to leave it at that.
And I just wanted to throw in there, like, also when we are imparting this care, this is something that I've struggled with, being at UCT, for instance, being available for care, bearing in mind how maybe students of color, this is something that is not always or readily available, and then them not taking advantage of that for whatever reason. Maybe it's me, maybe it's just, I don't know, maybe there are sort of other psychological issues that need to be considered there, but how the care then gets consumed by, say, non students of color, for instance. And there's that's something that I struggle a lot with, how the care is extended to the class and yet gets received by the very people you did not think needed it, because they've received so much of it. They've received it in abundance all their academic careers. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I had a lot more questions, but we run out of time. And so we have about 1 or 2 minutes. And so I just wanted to give that 1 or 2 minutes to you guys, if you have any closing statements, anything you wanted to get out that you weren't able to, yeah, so we can wrap up.
I wonder if maybe there's someone in the audience who has a burning comment or question. Maybe it would be great if they were, to offer.
I'm not seeing any other questions apart from the feminist anger question. So if you guys want to tackle that, because I feel like my question would be too long. So it's either that or any closing statements.
I don't want to address the feminist anger question because I feel like we can't do it in a minute, but I am going to save the chat and then maybe we can discuss it and address it back. I've saved the chat. I don't know what you feel, because I think if we have to wrap up in a minute, that might not do justice to the question, but really thank you for that comment. And I've saved the chat so we can, respond back to you in some way afterwards and continue the conversation. I also just want to say something that like a friend and collaborator has been writing, Chloe Turner has been writing about how instead of gifting our labor to institutions, we need to gift it to each other. And I keep going back to that in the context of just trying to apply this to whatever we are doing, like who are we actually gifting this work to? Is it the institution or is it to each other? And also then to take it further based on what Portia just said, like sometimes gifting it to each other is also really complicated, because then that gift becomes really unequal. Like you may have students who take advantage of that gift, or you may even have colleagues and friends who do. So also then to think about how to gift it to each other in a way where it's not extractive and exploitative and and it's nourishing and healing. It's all very complicated.
Yeah, we have to end now, unfortunately. But thank you so much, Dr. Mehta, Dr. Frank, Dr. Malachi, for this brilliant talk, and for everyone in the audience who participated, who joined us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you.